Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating breakdown. We're going to take an objective look at a recent broadcast from Sky News Australia that dives headfirst into the pretty turbulent waters of political transparency, fundraising, and public optics. Now, the commentators in this segment tackle two completely different political controversies happening on opposite sides of the country, but they use them to build this much larger argument about how politicians operate and ultimately how our public money is spent.
And that brings us to the big, overarching question driving today's analysis. How should political figures be held accountable for public trust and financial resources? So keep this question in the back of your mind as we go. It's really the core tension that connects the two seemingly unrelated stories we're about to explore, kind of tying them together into one cohesive critique by the hosts.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the scrutiny on California Governor Gavin Newsom. Next, the broadcast's allegations regarding the NGO sector. Then, we're going to unpack the sharp critiques of the Obama Presidential Center. And finally, debating that massive billion-dollar cost. All right, Section 1, scrutiny on Gavin Newsom, and a look at the commentary surrounding federal tax probes. So the Sky News broadcast kicks things off with a highly critical look at the California governor. They're focusing on this legal issue kind of brewing in the background. Specifically, they discuss a federal investigation involving Governor Newsom and his wife over tax-related conduct. But you know what's really interesting here? It's how the host frames Newsom right out of the gate. Before even getting into the weeds of the legal probe itself, the host jokingly calls him the Kendall of California. Yeah, they compare him to a male model, basically suggesting he's a politician way more focused on his hair and public image than, the actual day-to-day governing of the state. It absolutely sets the stage for the broadcast's pretty skeptical view of his leadership. The broadcast then highlights how Newsom is choosing to defend himself. They actually pull up this specific quote from the governor: "I am considering running for president." According to the commentators, Newsom is using this potential White House run as his main explanation for why the Justice Department is targeting him in the first place. But here is the crucial point. The hosts entirely reject that defense strategy. The broadcast argues that Newsom's approach is basically just blaming Donald Trump for the probe, trying to use political confrontation as a shield. They assert that he's failing to take a very serious federal investigation seriously. In their view, look, if Newsom is actually considering a run for the highest office in the land, he shouldn't be deflecting. Instead, they argue a true presidential contender should welcome an investigation. Why? To definitively prove their transparency to the voters. Moving on to Section 2, the NGOs sector allegations, connecting political power to non-governmental organizations. So the broadcast uses this whole investigation to launch into a much broader critique of California's political ecosystem. And it starts with this absolutely staggering number, 200,000. The guest on the broadcast points out that out of an estimated 1.5 to 2 million NGOs, non-governmental organizations operating across America, California alone has cornered the market with roughly 200,000 of them. But to be clear, the guest isn't citing this number to praise the state's charitable nature, not at all. Instead, they use that huge number to lay out some highly charged accusations. The broadcast claims that many of these charities essentially operate as a, quote, racket. The guest alleges they're fueled by untraceable foreign funds, or even taxpayer money, and that they exist primarily to push a leftist agenda to keep certain politicians in power. They even link them to what they describe as staggering medical fraud. It is a sweeping indictment of how political power and charity networks intersect, at least through the lens of this commentary. And to back up these massive claims, the commentators point to a very specific legal case. They highlight a political chief of staff who recently pleaded guilty to bank and wire fraud. The broadcast uses this guilty plea not just as some isolated incident, but as proof that deeper, systemic fraud exists within this whole political and NGO network. Fraud that, they insist, desperately warrants further exploration. To wrap up their segment on Governor Newsom and the California scene, the hosts summarize their stance with this classic phrase: "If you've got nothing to hide, then you got nothing to worry about." Basically, they're arguing that politicians need to lay everything out on the table, be completely transparent, show your records, rather than backing away and deflecting blame onto your political rivals.
Which brings us to Section 3, critiques of Obama's library, shifting focus to optics, architecture, and Bill Maher's sharp words.
Leaving California behind, the broadcast makes this dramatic pivot over to Chicago. The Sky News hosts play a clip of progressive commentator Bill Maher sharply criticizing his very own audience. On his show,
Maher actually calls his live audience effing liars when they clap and pretend they're actually planning to visit the new Obama Presidential Center. The broadcast really highlights this moment to show, hey, skepticism about this project isn't just coming from the political right, it's coming from voices on the left too.
And the critiques aren't just about whether people will actually buy a ticket and visit. They are highly focused on the physical design of the building itself. Bill Maher says the library looks like something aliens built in Dubai. Meanwhile, the Sky News guest takes it even further. They describe it as gulag architecture, inspired by brutalism, claiming it resembles an Ethiopian rock. Both sides are using this incredibly vivid hyperbole to express just a visceral disgust with the building's aesthetic. They think it's an absolute eyesore.
The guest emphasizes the specific design specs to really drive their point home. It's a windowless, 225-foot-tall museum sitting smack in the center of the complex. They note that it is literally the tallest presidential monument ever built. So for the commentators, this towering, windowless structure, it isn't viewed as a beacon of public service. Rather, they see it as this heavy, physical manifestation of a politician's ego.
All right, Section 4, debating the billion-dollar cost, analyzing the financial arguments against the monument.
Because for the broadcast, all that talk about the architectural aesthetic, that was really just the appetizer. The main course of their critique is the sheer scale of the cost. $1 billion. The broadcast points out that the estimated cost for the center has ballooned to somewhere between $850 million and nearly $1 billion. To the hosts, this price tag is just flat-out outrageous.
And to really hammer home why they find this cost so offensive, the commentators juxtapose it against national struggles. They contrast this roughly $1 billion monument to ego with the claim that, according to the guest, 1/3 of Americans currently lack fourth-grade reading proficiency. They're essentially asking, where is the logic in approving a billion-dollar rock in the middle of Chicago when that money could have been spent in a much better way, like, say, addressing actual societal deficits such as education?
The broadcast then circles right back to Bill Maher to sum up their feelings, highlighting this specific quote. Why does anyone need a presidential library, these monuments to somebody's ego out of office? And the Sky News hosts find themselves in total agreement with Maher here. This quote brings their entire argument full circle. It ties together the federal probes in California and the massive spending in Chicago to argue that too often modern politics is driven by personal optics, a lack of transparency, and ultimately wasted public resources.
So we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider after unpacking today's source material. Where exactly is the line between a political monument and a public utility? How should public trust, transparency, and these vast financial resources be managed long after our politicians leave office? It's a massive question and definitely one worth thinking about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.